Hello, Comics Alternative fans. Before we start with the episode, we want to invite all of you to check out our Patreon campaign.
That's right. Go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative for more details. There you'll find more information about the campaign and the cool rewards levels we have.
For as little as $1 a month, you can help us maintain good quality comics talk, and the more you contribute, the more perks you get.
These include monthly podcast episodes exclusive to Patreon supporters, as well as the chance to help us choose which books we review on the show. So be sure to visit www.patreon.com/comicsalternative and become one of our proud podcast patrons.
Yeah, and now on with the show.
This is the Comics Alternative Manga, reviews of Ken Niimura's Henshin and Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two guys, not quite with PhDs, talking about manga. And as we did on last month's episode, Shea, where we introduced our new manga series, we kind of joked around that, well, officially we're not two guys with PhDs, but we're a guy with PhD and a guy with a PhD in the future, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So it doesn't matter what kind of degree you have, as long as we can engage in some really good quality manga talk, that's what matters. And for the month of May, we're back with two more titles. First, we're going to be discussing the recent book by Ken Niimura, Henshin. And after that, we're going to take on a legendary manga series, Akira, by Katsuhiro Otomo. But before we get to those, we want to let all of our listeners know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials are at 40% off cover price. Sometimes they're at 50% off of the cover price. And many times, the discounts are more impressive than that.
That's right. And every month, you can get different books at different discounts. Like this month, you can get Fairy Tale Volume 9 from Hiro Mishima at 30% off, and or you could get the Scarlet Letter manga adaptation. Any fan of classic literature, you can get that for 30% off too.
That's right. They have great specials every single month. You have to go to their website and see what they are for May. That's dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. In fact, Shea, I am in the middle of reading that Scarlet Letter edition.
How is it?
I really like it. I picked it up the other day, and I haven't been able to get back to it over the past 2 days, but I'm impressed. I wish this had come out a couple of years ago. I was working on an article of comics adaptations of Nathaniel Hawthorne's fiction. And there's already one manga version of the Scarlet Letter that's out there, and I thought that was okay. This one, I think, is a bit more sophisticated, not only in terms of its art, but in the way that they're taking on the story itself. So I'm enjoying this. I just wish it had come out when I could have used it in my scholarly article that I wrote. But it's good. I think it's worth checking out. And there are a whole series of those that publisher's adaptation of classic works of literature. I know they do a version of Les Miserables. And then I think maybe Pride and Prejudice, if I'm not mistaken. So, and there are a number of these classic titles. So I think it's something definitely worth checking out if you like manga and if you like adaptation. But we're not going to be talking about adaptation on today's show. We're going to be looking at 2 manga titles. Now, Shea, when we got started last month with this new monthly series, we had told listeners that our game plan was every month look at least one relatively new manga title. And I say relatively new because we can define new in different ways. It could be a brand new book that has just come out. It can be a new translation of something that's been out for a while. It could be a new edition of something that had been out for a while. For instance, last month we discussed Geo, and that had been out for a number of years in English, but Viz Media recently came out with a new 1-volume edition, so that was new in our book. Mm-hmm. And this month we're looking at the new title from Ken Niimura, Henshin, and then an older title is Otomo's Akira, the famous Akira. And, as this monthly series evolves, it may get to the point, because there's plenty of new stuff coming out mm-hmm. there for us to discuss, it may come to a point that, we're discussing 2 new titles every month. And, whatever we choose to do, that's what the manga show will become as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, we're I think footloose and fancy free is a good way to describe what we're doing.
Yeah. Well, okay, let's get all footloose with Henshin.
All right. So I guess right before we were recording, I was telling you how difficult it was to find any information about Ken Niimura, and I told you I had to go through Google Translate to translate a Spanish Wikipedia article on him, and so I learned a little bit, and it turns out that he is half Japanese and half Spanish, and he's worked mostly in the Spanish and the Japanese markets, and the fact that he's European after reading Henshin, he's worked in the European market, makes it's clear in Henshin in hindsight, just because of to people who aren't familiar with the title. It's a collection of short stories that Image recently published, and I think it's the first time they've published manga, but it's in this that's almost like a European album, so it's a little bigger than a typical American trade paperback. But just reading the stories and the content, the way he blends these the European aesthetics and the Japanese aesthetics, but also the physical format of the work and the pace of the work, it makes a lot more sense. And I don't know if those. The way he blends those 2 traditions was clear to you at all when you were reading it, or what your take on that was?
It's interesting that you say that. I mean, a couple things from what you just set up come to mind. One is that this is from Image, and it's not often, and I can't remember another example of manga through Image, and there may be, I'm just not aware of it, but you don't seem to remember any as well, because usually if it is one of the larger publishers in the U.S. that's not specifically devoted to manga, for instance like One Piece or definitely Viz Media, then it's going to be Dark Horse, Fantagraphics, the Canadian Drawn and Quarterly, not Image. And so I think when I read through the 13 stories that compose Henshin, and the different tone, I thought, okay, well, maybe this is partly because this is an Image title, and maybe there's something about Niimura going to Image for this reason, that it goes hand in hand with the different feel, at least to a point, with these stories. And then another thing that occurred to me is the content of the story. You were talking about the style, the aesthetic that for you, and I want you to go into more detail in a moment, that mixes the Japanese with a more European sensibility. I was focusing in on the fact that a number of elements, narrative elements, the settings, some of the settings, as well as the themes, are very much aware of a European landscape. For instance, there's one story in this collection called Merci that actually takes place in France. But then there are other stories that have a lot to do with fitting into other cultures or being an outsider, being an immigrant. And so that makes more sense to me, since you just mentioned that Niimura is half Japanese, half Spanish, you discovered from this Wikipedia site.
Yeah. I mean, his work, when I was reading it, it really reminded me of Taiyo Matsumoto, who's done, we've talked about before on and off the air, who's done things like Sunny and Tekken Concrete and like Blue Spring and Go-Go Monster. And it turns out the stories in Henshin were originally published in a seinen magazine called Ikki, which was publishing Taiyo Matsumoto's Sunny. And that was really the first thing that jumped out to me of him kind of blending the European tradition and the Japanese tradition is I don't know. You asked me to elaborate on it, on the aesthetics, what I found in the aesthetics that reminded me of that. But I'm having a difficult time articulating precisely what. It's much different than the typical manga you see. It's much not just the pace of the stories, but the pace of the page and the way the panels are laid out, and you know, they're oriented for you to move from one to the other. It just feels, there's just something about it that feels more like a European album to me. And it's the same thing, like Taiyo Matsumoto is drawing very heavily from French and Belgian and Italian cartoonists to create his style. And I just found that same blend here, where it was a much more solemn pace, just to the pages themselves and the way they were laid out, but also to the looseness of his pencils, the way he relies on kind of not ink washes, but his use of grays.
Yes,
is a lot different from the black and white spotted blacks that you see in a lot of manga. And then again, the physical format reminded me. It's much different physically from manga. Just the size of it and the paper it's printed on, and that probably has a lot to do with it being published image instead of viz or vertical. But just that aspect of it really reminded me of European albums.
Yeah, it is a little larger than the typical trade paperback that you usually get with U.S. publishers. You know, I think another thing, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think another reason why both of us feel that this has somewhat of a more European feel to it is that there seems to be more action-to-action transition between panels and among panels than you get from, or at least a higher concentration of those than you would find in a lot of manga. And I'm thinking of what Scott McCloud lays out in, you know, his famous Understanding Comics, when he talks about the transition from one panel to the next. You know, there's, you know, moment to moment, scene by scene, and then action to action. And I think much of what defines American and European comics is a scene to scene or action to action transition between and among panels, right? So you say action, the next panel, another action, or another scene, another action, so on and so forth. Whereas with much manga, what you'll find is a higher prevalence of aspect-to-aspect transition. So, for instance, you will have a scene that is set, and you can have a page or more that gives you a series of panels that play out one aspect or perspective of a scene, another aspect or perspective of the same scene. In other words, The narrative has more room to breathe. The storyteller is using his or her art in a more leisurely way to let the setting and the scenario, the premise, what have you, visually unfold. So it's not just you're thrown into action and then there's another action, then there's some more action, then there's even more action after that. And I think with Niimura, we have quite a bit of action within each of the 13 stories. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about action in terms of wham bam fighting kind of comic book action like you'd find in superhero narratives. But there is a lot of activity going on, and it's almost as if Niimura doesn't give us much rest of the action within each of these 13 stories. And maybe this boils down to a combination of, this kind of Japanese-European blend, but at the same time, it may stem from the fact that, this is a collection of stories, and so each individual story, we don't have much time to lay things out in a slower, more measured manner, right? As you would find in a comic that has more of an aspect-to-aspect transition. So I'm wondering if that comes, if that contributes to what we're calling this kind of European feel of this manga.
I mean, like I said, it was originally, or these stories were originally published in Ikki, which is kind of what we would consider like an alternative manga magazine. They publish things, like I said, like Sunny, things that are pretty distinct. So I think just content-wise, there's certainly even for manga, even like among manga, they are pretty distinct, and I don't know. I mean, the back cover of Henshin says that Henshin, I guess, literally translates in Japanese to transformation, and so we do see. I mean, that's like the core, or supposed to be the core theme that kind of underlies each of these stories, and that does allow for a lot of different kinds of stories, a lot of different kinds of actions. Like you said, there is a lot of action, but it's not necessarily physical, although some of it is. But I don't know. I do think that the fact that he seems to be influenced by European cartoonists does contribute to that. It's more abstract than you would typically find in manga. I don't know. Is that I don't know. I feel like I got far afield from what you were saying. No. I think that both you and I are trying to get at what makes this different from a lot of the manga that we may be used to reading. Another thing that strikes me, I want to get back to something that you opened with, and that is, who exactly is Ken Niimura? And, you did a lot of digging around, and I appreciate that. My experience with Niimura is, before Henshin, is primarily with the book that he did a few years ago with Joe Kelly, and that is I Kill Giants. And you read that, correct? Yeah, I read it. Not first when it came out, but I read it a couple years ago, and I thought it was really fantastic. Yeah, it is. It's a very moving story, and I think last year, I think 2014, they came out with was it a 5-year anniversary? It was an anniversary edition of when it first came out, and they could do that because it had quite an impact and quite a following to that. So it had a lot of devoted readers to justify coming out with this new edition of the book, because it originally came out as a multi-issue miniseries or a limited series, and then I think it was collected, and then this new anniversary edition that came out last year. That was Joe Kelly's story, so we can't really say that it's a great example of Niimura's storytelling. Visual storytelling, I think, it is a great example of that. And going back and looking at I Kill Giants now after reading Henshin, I do get a sense of some of the commonalities between the two. And I tell you, one of the things that strikes me in the art of Henshin and then in I Kill Giants
is Niimura's sense of humor. Really comes out. Now, did you read the anniversary edition of I Kill Giants?
No, I read it maybe a year or two before that came out. So I've got the paperback version, but not that nice new anniversary one.
Okay, and I don't know if this is in the original collection, but in the anniversary edition, there are in the kind of the extra added section at the very end where they put some gallery art, but there are also a series of one-page stories that basically explains the relationship between Kelly and Niimura, and they're quite funny, and they're illustrated by Niimura, and the premise of them are basically all the same. You have Kelly at his desk, working, and in the background are, I guess, his kids making noise. And then Niimura comes in and says, "Hey, I got and depending on what that particular one-page strip is about the creation of I Kill Giants, it could be art, or I got the character, or I got the setting, or, we're working on publicity." So with each of these, was this in the collection you read or not?
It might have been. I doesn't sound familiar to me, so I don't think so, but I might just be misremembering.
Okay, because it's funny because the Niimura character comes in and says to Joe, "Hey, I think I got the character down," and he shows Joe what he has written, and of course it's nothing like Joe had imagined, and he's a little pissed off. But then his reaction is diplomatic. "Well, what if we tweaked it a little and changed it here?" And then Niimura says, "You're right. I'm glad I got this correct." And that's basically how those series of strips are. The art of I Kill Giants, the characters in I Kill Giants, the publicity behind I Kill Giants, and it's kind of funny. And I bring this up because Niimura not only has a great sense of humor, but he's also very self-deprecating. And I found Henshin, to come back to the book under discussion, one of the things that I found so interesting about it is that of the 13 short stories we have, 4 of them are autobiographical, and they're almost evenly spaced out. Story number 2 is called Kitty and Me. Story number 5, Salieri. Number 9 is titled Partey. Number 12 is Cat on Guard. So each of those 4 stories are in some way about Ken Niimura, because he is a character in these stories. And I think of these 2, the first and the last, Kitty and Me and Cat on Guard, they're about cats. Partey is about his ability to cook, and of course cats become a part of that as well. And then Salieri is his making fun of himself on getting story ideas. And, he comes to find out that he's not as original as he thinks he is. So, I mean, what did you think of those 4 autobiographical stories?
I really enjoyed Salieri. Now that I had forgotten about that one, because when you started talking about the autobi ones, my first instinct was, oh man, those are really the only stories in it in Henshin that I just didn't connect with at all. I do agree that he's pretty self-deprecating, but though those stories just didn't land with me in any really meaningful way. But you mentioned Salieri, and that one actually did. I really enjoyed his metaphor of for people who haven't read it. Salieri's it's an autobio story, and he talks about coming up with story ideas, and there's a metaphor in it he talks about where finding story ideas is like it's like reading a map, and you try and find like new things on a familiar route. And I really enjoyed that metaphor, and I thought that worked really well. But the ones with the cats, I just didn't find really I mean, they weren't terrible, but I just didn't find them as entertaining as some of the other stories in the book. My favorite joke in those, though, was the Partey one. The last page of it is a recipe for something in chorizo, and I just like that he does the manga thing of including like a recipe for any food he cooks in the comic. I really enjoyed that, but I don't know. Did you think they were were great. I mean, it seemed like you found them a lot more enjoyable than me.
No, I think I found them more curious than enjoyable. Now, I like them, don't get me wrong, but I think I'm more like you in that those 4 stories, and with the exception of Salieri, I'm with you on that. I think that's the strongest of the 4. But I think the other 3 especially, Kitty and Me, Partey, and Cat on Guard, they're okay. They're pleasant. I was about to use the word quaint, but that may seem a little condescending. But they definitely are of a different tone. They don't have the impact as the other stories have. And I think in that sense, they stand in stark contrast to almost every other story in there, the non-autobiographical ones. And maybe there's a reason why he inserted these 4 autobiographical pieces there in order to heighten the drama that primarily makes up the rest of the 13 stories. And so the other 9 are definitely of a different tone. Would you agree?
Yeah, just thinking about the stories now, and I guess working that the core theme or whatever is transformation of these stories. Those are really the ones that I can't find that in. I can't find any emotional or physical or intellectual transformation in any of those stories, and so they are very, very different tonally and content-wise from everything else in the book. I don't know. Were you able to make out that theme in any of those stories, or am I just not in the
autobio stories?
Yeah.
I think if you wanted to force the theme of transformation into them, you could, but they're not apparent. They're not overly apparent, I think. Now, the other stories are, and maybe in talking about the other 9 or the non-autobiographical stories, let me ask, do you have a favorite 1 or 2 that really stood out to you?
I was just thinking of that one. I really enjoyed the stories that bookend the books, or the book.
No Good and Shut Up?
Yeah, that kind of serve as a literal introduction and then kind of an exit. I like those. And then I can't recall the name of it, but the one about the 2 friends who meet over the baseball game.
Oh, yes, The Victory Sign.
Yes, I really liked that. I thought that was I thought that was the strongest, most effective story in here. But they were all pretty good. I enjoyed, with the exception of the cat ones. I enjoyed all of them a pretty good amount. I don't know which one did you enjoy the most?
I have to say that one of the ones that, or the 2 that really stood out to me, and that's because of the dramatic impact they had, were the one of the 2 friends that you mentioned who met over baseball, The Victory Sign, and then the other one that deals with suicide is Watermelon in Summer.
Yeah, I like that one too, but I brought a little baggage with it, and I couldn't enjoy it as much as maybe you, because there's a Junji Ito serial. Speaking of, we talked about Junji Ito's Gyo last episode, and I couldn't help but think of him in this one because there's a serial he did called The Black Paradox that it's longer than this story, but its first chapter is almost identical to it until the part where the old man comes back and starts berating the young people for leaving trash in the forest. Up until that point, it's almost identical to that Junji Ito story. So I couldn't help but recall that and bring my own baggage to it. So maybe if I wasn't as familiar with that, I would have enjoyed it more. But I was just kind of creeped out for about half of it.
So did you think it was derivative?
No, I didn't think it was derivative. The ending of the Niimura one is completely different. The back half of it is. I couldn't get it out of my head when I was thinking of it. And so that just kind of maybe lessened how effective it was or could have been. But I don't think they're derivative. I don't think I would never accuse of Niimura stealing from Ito. But there were some similarities.
Yeah,
they're just drawing from the collective unconscious, shall we say?
Yeah. I think those two stood out, especially the victory sign to me, because that definitely has a really impactful ending, very tender, but at the same time kind of hard, if that makes sense, how it hits you. But that one. Another one I enjoyed quite a bit just because of the social message that it has mixed in with humor is Lying is Bad. This is the 8th story.
I can't. Which one is that?
This is the one where you have it's almost like one of these Godzilla stories.
Oh, yeah.
Where someone transforms into this big monster and then they have to get rid of him. And so, in this story, you find police officers or detectives who are investigating a crime, and they're trying to figure out, who committed this crime. And there are a few suspects, and I think that there are 4 in particular. And the younger detective is the one that basically helps to solve the mystery, because what they do is they give them bowls of, I think it's noodles, or at least some kind of dish.
I think it's beef bowl. Beef bowl. They make a point of saying.
Yes, and they ask people to use chopsticks, and one by one they narrow down who the culprit isn't until they get to someone who is, I guess, a non-native, and they because he's frustrated at the way he can't fit in to Japanese society. He can't eat the beef bowl correctly, use the chopsticks as he should, or as everyone else does. He becomes angry, and then he turns into this big monster who literally grows into monster size. And I just think it's hilarious, and the way that they get rid of him is by getting him really angry. They say, listen up, your Japanese is terrible. The way you yammer on the subway with your friends is really annoying. It irritates everyone around you. And the thing Japanese always say about you looking like a Hollywood actor, of course, it's a total lie. And then he just explodes and, he's gone. I think that it's wonderful, because if we read this through American eyes, these are some of the same stereotypes that we throw at people who are not native to the United States. They come over here, they eat their own food, they don't fit in, they speak their own language, they yammer. And then it's the aftermath that I think is so effective. This is where the message is, where the older detective asks, how could such an awful thing happen? And then the younger officer says, well, I guess if we talk to them out of kindness, they interpret it a different way. And another officer says, maybe you're right. I think I'll try talking normally next time. Yeah, there's got to be a way for us all to get along. And then the older detective says, what a wonderful country this is. Kanta, how did you figure this all out? And then he tells, but and then there's a comedic ending as well that I think is the nice cherry on the top of this story. But at first it is the foreigner, the outsider to Japanese culture, that is the culprit here, who is the literal monster. But then once he's gone, then they realize, well, maybe we helped to create the monster. Why don't we try to be nice and all get along? And so that may sound like a very pat thematic ending to this story, but then I think the comedic ending undermines that that kind of sweet wrap up.
Right, and the person who the detective who figures out how, or like what the monster is and what's causing him. He mentions that he has a foreign mother.
That's right.
That ending makes more sense to me now after learning that Niimura is half Spanish, and he lives and works in Japan as someone who's not fully Japanese, or wouldn't be considered fully Japanese by the Japanese standards. And you mentioned that it is funny, and it is a humorous story, and it's really impressive that he was able to bring that levity to a story that is dealing with some pretty heavy things. I mean, I don't know how much you know about Japanese culture, but from what I understand, if you're not fully ethnically Japanese, you are not considered the same as someone who is. So people who are born in Japan, lived their entire lives in Japan, whose parents were born and lived in Japan, but they are ethnically Korean, they're not treated the same as people who are ethnically Japanese. So this bringing that level of humor to something that is a very serious topic. You mentioned reading it through Americanized, but considering like Japanese politics, it becomes even more serious. And so it was really impressive to see him talking about these things in such a light tone. But I think it's also a perspective that he's only able to have because of the nature of his genealogy. I think that lends him a certain perspective that a native Japanese person wouldn't necessarily have.
Right, and that's something we see. I've done a lot of work in my scholarship with ethnic and immigrant literature, and that's one of the things that you find going on in a lot of American ethnic writing, is that outside perspective that really gets at the heart of the American character as only someone from the outside could bring.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, it'd be interesting to see what like a Japanese reader thought of this story, if they got a different take on it or not.
Yeah. But getting back to the other one that I really liked, and that is the victory sign. This is the story of two friends, and we see them in, I guess, their younger days. This is Kosuke and Kita, and they meet one day over baseball, and they become very good friends. We see them at middle age, and then toward the end of the story, we see them in older age, and it is Kosuke who is he's probably dying. He's definitely in the hospital, and he looks to be on life support. So there's definitely something wrong with him, and it is his friend Kita who goes to see him, and it is Kita who is, as we see throughout the story, who's the shorter one. So he literally looks up to his friend Kosuke, but he figuratively also looks up to him. And then what Kita finds out at the end, that it was actually Kosuke looked up to him a lot as well. And it's that touching moment. And I don't want to give anything away, but the way that the story ends, I don't think it's necessarily sad, but it's very tender. And I'm not meaning that in any kind of ironic way. It is very dramatic, very touching. I think tender may be an appropriate word for the end of the story. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what makes it so impactful for me.
Yeah, it has a really nice, it's not like it's a sweet ending, but it's not cloying. It's not overly so. It's very well paced in the way Niimura plays that scene. It doesn't linger too much. It doesn't overplay its hand. I like that it really forces us. It's a like you said, it's not a sad moment, but it is a really emotional moment, and he doesn't make it like Oscar bait is like in common parlance. It's not. It doesn't feel forced or unnatural. It's a very emotional moment, and I like the way that Niimura paces that last scene. Yeah. But you mentioned they become friends over baseball, and one thing I really liked about the book is that it is, if you look at all of the stories, it does hit upon so many different genres, and I like that in this story it is partly like a sports story that's secretly about friendship, and I don't know how familiar you are with like sports manga, but Takehiko Inoue's comics like Slam Dunk or Real, or there's a couple others like basketball and baseball and just a bunch of different sports manga that they are the action is about sports, and it's about the teammates working together, but it's secretly about friendship and how like sports fosters these deep friendships, and you can express those relationships and your feelings about those relationships through the sports. And I really like that this kind of hits upon that very, very Japanese genre. I don't know. I feel like a lot of American readers will overlook that, but I did enjoy that aspect of it.
Right, you're right that there are a variety of different genres represented in this collection. You know, there's stories about cooking, and I don't know the Japanese word for it, but you know, I mean, there seems to be a genre for every kind of manga. But you know, there's one that deals with food preparation and cooking, crime, coming of age. There's just a variety. There's one in particular, what is it, the Last Train, that deals specifically with an office worker, which is a completely different kind of premise and setting that stands out as different from about every other story in the collection. The Salaryman manga is that's a very, very uniquely Japanese genre that I don't think we have any. I mean, there's like, I guess The Office or like workplace sitcoms or workplace dramas is the Harvey
closest thing.
Pekar may be the closest thing we get to that.
Kind of.
Maybe.
In Japan, there's like, I can't recall the name of it, but there's a serial that's been running for like 30 years or something, and it's literally followed this guy's like ascension through the ranks of his company, and every time he gets a promotion, the series ends, and then it restarts with his new job title. And it was like Salaryman so-and-so for like 10 years. And then it was like Section Chief so-and-so for 10 years. And so there are manga that have run for longer than some people have been alive, that are literally the action and the drama and the plot is entirely derived from let's watch this person wake up in the morning and go to work, and let's see what he does at work, and he got a promotion. The big moment climax is he got a promotion. I don't think we have anything like that in America. That's a really, really niche thing. But he does kind of work that into this one. But this is kind of an anti-salaryman story because in those it lionizes giving up your life for the company and how the company is all that matters and that's the greater good. But in this, it's kind of him kind of finding relief and finding happiness, a little bit of happiness outside of the company. So it kind of subverts the salaryman tropes a little bit. But that's, I don't know. I think there's a lot in this. There's a lot like that in the book that's, if you're not really familiar with these very Japanese, these very manga tropes, you're not going to get as much out of it as someone who is more familiar might. But I don't know. I don't know if you picked up on any of that or not.
Maybe a little, not near as much as you, but I think this is one of those books, though, that someone with no background, no familiarity at all with manga can come to, and yeah, there may be a lot of things that they don't pick up on, but that doesn't matter. I mean, they can still get a lot out of the book from a cold reading, from having no introduction whatsoever to manga. I think the one exception to that would be if they've never read manga and they're not used to reading from right to left, then it take them a little getting used to, because we haven't pointed out that, this book, there's a lot of manga published in English that read in the traditional Western left to right style. But this one, I found it kind of curious. One of the only examples, if not the only that I can think of at least, of manga produced by Image, they chose to present this in the traditional Japanese right to left style. But I think other than that, if someone just comes to this with no experience in manga, they'll get a lot out of it. Now, I want to come back to something that you brought up fairly early, and that is the frame narratives that introduce us to and then take us out of this collection. And those are the stories No Good and Shut Up. And they nicely frame the entire collection. First and foremost, because they deal with the same characters. there is a young girl by the name of Natchan, and she comes to, in this first story, No Good, she comes to stay with her uncle. What is her uncle's name?
I can't recall her uncle's name either.
But he's an uncle.
She's staying with her uncle and aunt.
Yes, and so in this first story that opens the collection, No Good, she arrives, and so the uncle greets her at a station of some sort, and then...
I believe it's a train station.
It looks like a train station, but unlike the last story, we don't see much.
Yes.
We see him waving. Yeah, I guess it is because there's an arrival board and a clock, but we don't get to see much of that station. It's only on that first page. But in this first story, she is arriving just as we arrived to the book, and this is the first story in the collection. And then the very last story of the collection, which is titled Shut Up, we have the uncle taking Nat Chan back to the station in order to leave. She's leaving. Her visit is over. And so not only is this do these serve as nice bookends or frames in that they begin and end this collection, but also there's this series of movement, right? She arrives at the station just as we arrive to the narrative. She departs as we are exiting this narrative experience that Niimura has provided us. And I think that that's really nice. Although that first story of the collection kind of surprised me a bit. No Good. And I don't want to give anything away, but at the end of this story, it turns into something very different from what you would expect.
Certainly. But I do think that as much as I enjoyed both of them as these physical openings and closings and beginnings and endings and entrances and exits and all that, I did find that they were the two least substantive stories. I don't know if you thought they worked well on their own, but I felt they worked. They certainly worked very well in context, but they were the only stories that wouldn't have worked on their own. And I don't know if you what you made of that, of their ability to stand alone.
I agree. I don't think they do. I don't think they could stand alone as much or as well as the other stories in the collection do. And I think that what I like so much about them is the narrative function that they serve as the beginning and end points of this book. Because you're right, story-wise, there's not a lot there. I mean, I think there's enough that they could, but I don't think they have the same impact as almost every other story in this collection does. Now this leads me, talking about the function that they play in terms of an intro and outro, kind of a framing device. If Henshin is Japanese for transformation, then the assumption is, if we're to believe the back cover copy of this book, that about every story in here has something to do with transformation. And we've already mentioned that, at least in the autobiographical pieces, that really doesn't come out that clearly. Would you call this a cohesive collection of short stories? I wouldn't go as far as to call it a short story cycle. And what I mean by a short story cycle, some people have called it a composite novel. I prefer the term short story cycle, is that each of the stories could stand alone on its own if it had to, but they're linked in such a way that they gain a larger meaning by being read as a collection. A classic example of this is Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio, or Ernest Hemingway's In Our Time, in that you can read individual pieces, and they have been collected separately, like in various anthologies, but if you put them all together, and they're connected through either similar characters or similar settings, sometimes through theme. And this is where I want to go here. I don't think theme is the best indicator of what you would call a short story cycle, because arguably, every author has his or her themes that they keep coming back to again and again and again. And if you take a collection of their short fiction that they may have created throughout their career, then you're pretty darn assured that they're going to have similar themes that you can pick out. So I really don't think that theme is a clear indicator of whether something is a more cohesive cycle or not. I wouldn't call this a cycle, but I think it's the inclusion of those opening and closing stories that at least teases that this may be a little more cohesive than it actually is.
I do think that I mean, it does work really well as a collected work. It reads really well in one sitting, and there aren't really any of the stories that jump out as just you don't understand why they're in the collection. I mean, I've made it pretty clear that I didn't really find I didn't really like the 3 cat ones, and those are the if any of them are going to stand out as being kind of weird within the book, it's going to be those. Right. But I do think that it does work well as a collected volume. It's not like a random anthology or anything like that. It does feel maybe not as cohesive as it could have been, but it does feel pretty unified.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Well, I'm glad we agree.
So, Shea, you want to move on to the other title that we're going to be discussing today, and that is Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything else to add on Henshin, so I think we can move on, unless you had something you wanted to mention quickly.
No, I think we covered a good deal of Henshin, and the challenge of dealing with Akira is that this is such a behemoth narrative. It's now published. It's collected in 6 volumes from Kodansha Comics. This was originally serialized between 1982 and 1990 in the Japanese publication Young Magazine. And I think it wasn't the first English translation in Marvel's Epic Comics imprint?
It was the first comic ever colored digitally.
Okay.
So it was Marvel who originally did that, and then Dark Horse did it, and then Kodansha finally got the rights back when they started doing their own English language releases.
Right, so that's the volume. If you're picking up Akira for the first time and you're getting brand new editions, then it is Kodansha that is going to be the publisher of those books. So they're in 6 really nice paperback editions. And these, unlike Henshin and a lot of manga that we have and will be discussing in the months to come, you don't read it from right to left. You read it from left and right. So in other words, the reading experience is very Western.
Yeah, it is, and that's not the only aspect of it that feels Western. I mean, it's one of the books that really brought manga into the hands of Western comic book readers, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that its story and characters and plot are very, very they're things that would be very familiar to readers of Western comics.
Right. I think so too. And I think I've mentioned on this show, on our manga show, I know I've mentioned quite a number of times on our regular review shows that my kids, especially my daughter, very, very, very much into manga. But, I have not gotten her to read Akira yet. So I would be curious to hear her reaction once she, let's say, read the first volume of Akira, to see if she thought that this is quite a bit different from the manga that she's used to reading, because she reads Bleach. Another one of her favorites is Black Butler. So, this is a very different kind of title than that. But, I'm just wondering if it would strike her as experientially different from the other manga that she reads that maybe I'm not familiar with. But you're right. I mean, there is a lot of action here. And do you know if any of the previous editions of Akira you had to read from right to left?
I don't off the top of my head. I think the Dark Horse ones might have been right to left, but I've never read those editions, so I don't know for sure. But I think that those were not flipped. But I don't know. I could be completely misremembering that.
Okay, now one of the reasons why we chose this one is, well, one, our original intention was to choose, at least one new title, and then the second one could be a classic or an older manga title. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we decided on Akira. And then another reason is that, well, this is a classic. at least for Western readers, manga title. I think chances are if someone has heard of anything that's going to be manga related and not maybe, titles like Dragon Ball Z or anything like that, it's going to be Akira that they would recognize. So this is a classic manga, at least, especially for the Western reader. Now, I know that sometimes you like to play the contrarian. Is there any part of Shea that would argue that this is against the fact that this is a classic work of manga that we should all revere and read on a regular basis?
Absolutely not. Akira is one of my favorite comics of all time.
Oh, darn. I was hoping to get you to say something controversial that would piss off a lot of our listeners.
No, I love the movie is one of my favorites. Otomo is one of my favorite cartoonists. I've written extensively about my love for Otomo and Akira, and both his and the books and the films import. I have nothing but praise for him. I have nothing but praise for the book, and there's probably not a lot of overlap between our listeners and Kanye West fans, but if there is, he did a music video for his song
Otomo?
Kanye West did a music video for Stronger, I think is the name of the song, and he stole almost every shot for that music video from the movie. From Akira. So even Kanye West is on board with Akira. Anyone who tells you that it's not awesome is a liar or someone you should not associate with.
Oh, okay. Now, I have to admit that when we last saw each other, which was a couple of weeks ago, I think, at the On Location episode at Collected in Plano, I think then I had told you that I hadn't yet seen the Akira anime. But since then, I have seen it, and I wanted to make sure that I saw it before we discussed Akira, the manga. And I liked it, but you were right. It is strikingly different. And not just strikingly different in the sense that certain volumes almost were entirely left out of the film. And, really, with a saga this size, if you wanted just a 2-hour, and I think it's just a little over 2 hours running time, feature film, there's no way to include everything. If you wanted to include as much as you could of all 6 volumes of Akira, it would have to be something like the Lord of the Rings trilogy, right? At least contain it within 3 films. But there's a lot that's cut out. But there are even parts of the premise that are significantly different than the manga. And that surprised me a bit. It didn't disappoint me. I didn't like it or dislike it. It was just different.
Yeah, it's really, really different. I know I mentioned it to you off the air, but when my girlfriend, who started reading the manga and just tore through it and loved it, there is for people who have maybe read the manga but have not seen the movie. I don't think that's many people, but just in case, there's a big twist. There's a big difference in the film than in the comic. And when she got to that scene and she discovered what was different about it, she turned to me and told me that I had ruined her life, because I had shown her the movie, and she did not like that difference at all.
Well, what difference are you talking about?
So I guess I should say spoiler warning. I don't really, but some people get bothered by that. But I don't know. It's a 25-year-old movie. I don't know why I'm bothering. It's when they discover that Akira in the movie, Akira is dead the whole time.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. When they pulled out his organs from the freezer, she just looked at me and said, "You've ruined my life," because she liked the scenes with Akira in the comics so much. But it is incredibly for people who haven't seen the movie, I can't really communicate just how different they are. They are completely different beasts. But I know I mentioned to you that they made the movie 2 years before the ending of the comic, so the comic was still running and people were reading it, and it hadn't ended when the movie came out. So they had to dig themselves out of that hole.
Yeah. Now, in the manga series, we don't see Akira, the character. We don't see the boy until toward the very end of the second volume, and that's when Tetsuo frees him, and we see him, and he does seem like this ordinary, kind of cute, cuddly, unassuming little kid, right? And we're trying to make sense of, this is someone that caused all this destruction, who ignited basically what, it's called the World War III. So, it was surprising when I saw the anime, and then they brought him out of the freezer, and he wasn't this cute little boy. He was a series of organs in jars. That was a little surprising.
Yeah, they had to cut out 1,000 pages. They had to cut out 2/3 of the comic, though, so they needed to.
Okay, so now, we are going to have a number of listeners who have not picked up one page of Akira to read, so this is going to be completely new to them. So if you wanted to introduce Akira, let's say the premise, to the uninitiated reader, how would you do so?
I would say, I don't know, because so many of the major plot elements don't even show up until, like you said, the second volume and the third volume. I don't know, in a future Japan, young punks get into trouble with the government and psychic kids, and that doesn't even do it justice.
Yeah. So you do have the government involvement, and we learn as we get more and more into the series that the government had activity going on where they were using young kids to try to research psychic abilities in order to use them in a weaponized manner. And in the course of this, let's say back in the 1980s, one of the kids that had been part of this experiment, Akira, ends up igniting a nuclear explosion. It destroys Tokyo and starts World War III. And so basically that's how Volume 1 begins. And then I think the time setting is what? Quite a number of years later, I think about 2019. And now we're in Neo-Tokyo. So this is a new city that's built from the rubble. And it is a post-apocalyptic setting. There are parts of Neo-Tokyo that are nice, but then there are a lot of it, at least the parts that we see, that seems to be run down. And it looks like the kind of post-apocalyptic setting that you're used to if you watch a lot of post-apocalyptic films or read a lot of post-apocalyptic narratives. So it does have that, desolation look to it. But in the midst of this are, motorcycle gangs, and, one of them is led by Kaneda. At first I thought the name was pronounced Kaneda, but then when I saw the movie, it's Canada. So it's like the country almost. And that's where his friend Tetsuo, who ends up becoming very powerful, and he becomes the antagonist of the series. He's a part of this motorcycle gang at first. And then part of the backstory is the relationship between Tetsuo and Kaneda, in that they were friends, they were growing up, neither of them had parents, they were both foster kids, and so that's one of the things that bound them. But yet there was this rivalry between the two, in that Kaneda was the one who always seemed to be in control, the one who Tetsuo always thought looked down at him and had to take care of him. And those kind of feelings that Tetsuo harbored against Kaneda come to the fore in the last half of this series, especially in the final 2 volumes. And that's where a lot of the destruction and death comes into play. So, there are a lot of characters. When we call this a saga, it's a saga in the fullest sense of the term, because, you have the individual players, and the main characters are some that we've already mentioned, Kaneda and Tetsuo, but another main character, and I think this was, you could say this is arguably the other main character, is a female by the name of Kei. And she becomes Kaneda's love interest, kind of reluctantly. At least by the end of the book, she seems that way. But she's part of this revolutionary group that is trying to undermine the current government of Neo-Tokyo because they feel that they were a part of, what happened to the old Tokyo that caused all the problems that they're in. And along with Kei is you pronounce his name Ryu? R-Y-U.
Yeah, Ryu.
Yeah, and he's also a revolutionary. And so their revolutionary activities kind of cross over Kaneda Tetsuo's engagement with a group of people called the Espers. And these are some of the original younger kids back in the 1980s that the Japanese government did these experiments on. And the ones who survived, this mass explosion back in the 80s that wiped out Tokyo as we know it, these are the ones that have remained. And they each have names, but they also go by numbers, right? So Akira is one of these survivors, and his number is number 28. And we see in this story, I think, a total of 5 of the original kids, one of which is someone by the name of Lady Miyako, whose number is 19. And she becomes, especially in the last half of Akira, in the last 3 volumes, she becomes a major player. We were talking about the first half, the last half. One of the things I like about this series is you can take the 6 volumes and they almost nicely, evenly divide between volumes 1 and 3 and then 4 and 6. And what the dividing point is another catastrophic event that takes place in Neo-Tokyo, again, largely thanks to Akira and then, along with him, Tetsuo, because Tetsuo becomes more and more closely associated with Akira. He becomes powerful in ways that Akira was. Now, the problem with Tetsuo is that he's having a problem reining it in, his power. And I think a lot of the problem is due to the fact of, a lot of the feelings that he harbors against Kaneda and others as well earlier in his life. So he's someone who's emotionally unstable, and it's this instability that helps, along with the powers of Akira, to cause the catastrophe that ends Volume 3 and then takes us into Volume 4. And then from Volume 4 on into 5 and 6, it almost becomes a different story altogether. I mean, we have, similar premises, similar characters, but we're introduced to new events, new characters, and new situations. So, for instance, the United States becomes a major player, arguably so, in the last half of Akira, where in the first half it's nowhere to be seen.
Like I said, when I was trying to describe it, there's so much of it that plays a pivotal role that doesn't show up until very late in the game. But yeah, it's I don't know. It's tough to describe. There's so much going on. We mentioned that it's very Western in a lot of ways, in the way it's paced and its characters and the way it's drawn and stuff like that. And but it's also very Japanese in its kind of obsessions with not nuclear power, but something that can be read as nuclear power, with bureaucracy, with like religious cults and stuff like that. So there's so much going on that is very. It's very tough to describe. It's very tough to encapsulate. But it's very, very Japanese.
When you mentioned cults, and along with that, I would put the cult of personality. This is another one of those things that you don't get until the second half of the series. And once we get into volumes 4, 5, and then 6, I found it fascinating that Neo-Tokyo, for all practical purposes, seemed to be divided between these two major powers, both of which arguably are a cult. One is the aforementioned Lady Miyako and the people who follow her. She's someone who seems to everyone that she could help them in their plight, because people are, they're starving, they're without shelter, their world has just been devastated again. So they turn to Lady Byakuya, but at the same time, the rival faction is what's called the Great Tokyo Empire. And this is ruled jointly by Akira and especially Tetsuo. And in fact, Akira is more of a figurehead than anything, it seems, because he seems to, Akira the kid just seems off in some other region thinking of other things and not really worried about the Great Tokyo Empire. But it's the cults that they breed, especially with the Great Tokyo Empire. And that's where things get interesting in a very different way, because there are some characters that are a part of the Great Tokyo Empire that are curious, if not creepy. And one of my favorite creepy characters is Birdman.
I can't recall who that is. Refresh my memory.
No, Birdman is this kid who, I guess he's blind. He's all the time wearing a bandage over his eyes, or a blindfold over his eyes, but on the blindfold is a picture or a drawing of one large eye. And so he stands up on top of a building, and basically he sees, I guess through some kind of sixth sense, what's going on. So he can describe people and situations that are going to be of endangerment to the Great Tokyo Empire. And he screams out, "There are two men who are coming, and they have guns, and they're going to do us harm, and you can find them at the corner of this street and that street." And so, he doesn't, literally see them, but he sees them in his mind's eye, so to speak. And so that's why they call him a Birdman, because he is perched way up top, and nothing gets by him. He's one of these creepy characters that becomes part of the Great Tokyo Empire. I think the most disturbing one is a character by the name, I think he goes by the name of Captain. He's this young guy, and the way that he is dressed, or the way that he's drawn, you can tell he is definitely out of 1980s. Because
he's the one with that like suit who seems like a used car dealer.
Yeah, in the thin 80s tie.
Okay.
And nothing wrong with thin 80s tie. I wore thin 80s ties, but I mean, come on. I mean, you can tell that he is a product of the 1980s imagination, and he's rather ruthless.
Yeah, he seems. Like you mentioned, Akira being a figurehead, he seems to be the kind of guy who's almost like the worm tongue. If anyone who's familiar with Lord of the Rings, he seems kind of the guy who feels like he can get some of that power by whispering in the king's ear. But yeah, he's definitely a slime ball. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
The Tokyo Empire, the Great Tokyo Empire characters are all they're almost like anarchic. They're definitely like the post-apocalyptic, like the characters, the fringe character, like the background characters, like the Road Warrior, for example, the ones who are those are the guys who are going to like eat their friends to survive. They've got all the weirdos in that group.
Yeah, but again, I mean, this is something that you pointed out. You don't get this kind of dynamic until you're over halfway into the series, and so this is one that is definitely hard to put your finger on in terms of encapsulating this in a summary, because there's so many moving parts. There's so many characters, so many shifts in settings and scenarios, and it, in fact, you had even told me when we were speculating on whether or not to discuss this, you say, "Wow, it's a lot to discuss," and I said, "Well, we don't have to go over everything." But after discussing Akira on our podcast, we can say that we now have, or at least are approaching having, manga creds.
Yeah, this is the foundational one that we kind of got to check that box.
Yes.
You mentioned it. There's so many shifts in setting and tone and perspective and pace and all that. And just thinking about that, Akira is it's something that works really, really well in the format that it's presented in. I think it really benefits from the space of those 3,000 pages or whatever it is, of the 6 volumes. The medium it's in, and the fact that it was serialized does have it does use the space that it's given to kind of do whatever it's in the mood for, shall we say, to go off in one direction for a little while or follow one character for a couple of scenes or a couple chapters and then spend the next volume. I mean, Kaneda disappears for what, like 2 volumes? And he was supposed to be our main character. And so because of its format, it is able to be all of these different things at the same time and not feel really scattershot or scatterbrained. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that would have worked in the film. I am glad that they kind of pared it down so much, and were able to make the film work really well in that kind of 2.5 hour format, and it's so much more streamlined. But yeah, Akira is as a comic, it is something that it does utilize the fact that it is a comic very, very well.
Yeah, and we've discussed, and you mentioned just now, differences between the anime and the manga. One of the things that I'm sorry was a character that was left out of the animated version is Chiyoko, because she is one kick-ass character. This is a woman who is tall, hardy, very strong, and she's very good with weapons. And I think she plays a very central and enjoyable role in Akira, the manga series. I will tell you the one thing about Akira that didn't really resonate with me, as well as every other parts of it seemed to a lesser degree in the animated version, and that is what happens at the very end. And this is in Volume 6. Mm-hmm. The very, very long, ongoing series of scenes where Tetsuo seems to transform, where his body starts to grow, become almost obscenely large, mm-hmm. and he starts to incorporate things into him. He starts to, what he consumes becomes a part of his body. This is what I call the meaty part of the story, because Tetsuo becomes this, blobbish little, piece of meat that grotesquely grows and starts taking things into him, like even Canada. So people as well as things. And after a while, it was this morphing into this blob creature, of Tetsuo morphing into this blob. It just seemed to go on for a long, long time. And after a while, I was going, okay, Otomo, quit playing this out. I think you've milked this for all of it's worth. That seemed to me a little long in the final volume. So I think in getting through Volume 6, I probably read a little quicker than I should have, because I was getting tired of those scenes over and over again. Do you feel the same?
I didn't. I like those. Admittedly, my experience with like Japanese body horror is not that vast or deep, but I've got a little bit of experience with it, and it's much like grosser than like that, like the body horror, venereal horror that Western audiences might be familiar with people like David Cronenberg. Mm-hmm. So I felt like he was drawing on that a little bit, and just playing out this like really just intentionally just like grotesque and horrifying just transformation that I really enjoyed. I appreciated how long it went on, but it is almost kind of sadistically long.
Yeah, it is. And the whole body horror that you mentioned, I don't have a problem with that, because if you remember last month, Junji Ito, Gaio, as well as a work that we didn't discuss but we referenced, Uzumaki. Mm-hmm. Those have everything to do with mm-hmm. body horror, and I love those. The thing with Akira, especially with Tetsuo in Volume 6, it just seems to go on forever. So, and I guess if you like that kind of storytelling, that is like throwing red meat to the reader, so to speak, mm-hmm. By showing all of that meatiness of mm-hmm. Tetsuo. But anyway, other than that, though, I think that it was outstanding. And it is definitely a title that if you're going to read manga, you have to confront.
Yeah, last episode we talked about briefly, when we were kind of introducing how we defined manga, we talked about the differences in just the storytelling and the pacing. And I know some people would disagree, but Paul Pope talks about, and he's worked for Kodansha in the 90s for a little while, and he didn't have anything published by them, but he worked on some stories, and he actually did, like, he was doing the, like, 14, 15 pages a week kind of schedule that they're supposed to do, and he talks about one thing he took away from that is what he calls a manga lesson, or like just the pace that the manga stories move at. He talks about is a product of the way they're serialized in those 15-page chapters, and they're really disposable, and so they can get away with, we're going to do 45 pages of fight sequences, and there's not going to be no dialogue. And if we saw something like that in an American comic, we would refer to it as gratuitous, and it would be unnecessary, and we would just like flip through it really quickly, like you did with that scene with Tetsuo kind of transforming, and you mentioning it like that. The fact that you read it more quickly, I was thinking that maybe that has to do with the way it was paced and the way it was serialized. It was supposed to be read really quickly. It was supposed to be just kind of flipped through, and you could read it at a glance because of the way it was designed. So maybe you did what you were supposed to do, and you read it how it was intended. But I like I said, I enjoyed the length of that scene. Yeah, I can see how other people like you might not.
Other people like me.
Other people like you who do. I mean, okay. People like you who just they weren't into it.
Yeah. Well, it's not like I wasn't into it. I just thought that it seemed to go on longer than it should have. It's like, okay, we've done this and you've done it again. Mm-hmm. Now you're doing it a third time, so let's move on. So, but again, I don't want to sound like I'm harping on that. I did like the ending of this. It was just that whole blob meat guy thing with Tetsuro seemed to go on a little longer than they liked. But
there's like I have heard that there is a fight sequence in a Bleach story arc that is it comprises almost like 2 or 3 entire volumes. So maybe you'd feel the same way about that fight sequence. Maybe you'd feel the fight sequence went on too long. You weren't getting your money's worth for the speed at which you were reading those volumes.
Yeah, and it's not just manga. It's also, I remember reading Death of Superman and Doomsday. I thought that Superman's fight with Doomsday went on painfully too long.
That's interesting because I mean those. The thing with those issues is like the fourth from the last one, they like got smaller panel counts per page on each one until the final fight was just like one panel, one. I guess I'm trying to say one panel page, but that sounds dumb. Just like a full page spreads. There we go of the fight. So maybe that contributed. Just the speed at which you were intended to read it was just you just weren't vibing with.
Are you talking about Death of Superman?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe that's what we're getting at is you just don't like the way some things are paced.
Yeah, it's but those are 2 examples that just occur to me. We're talking about Akira. That was the one part at the end that seemed to slow down a little bit for me, and ironically, I sped up through it. But anyway, so do you have any final thoughts, any parting words on Akira? I don't. I have a little fun fact for anyone who last week we talked about Satoshi Kon's Opus, and for people who are familiar with how manga is made, most manga artists have assistants, and Satoshi Kon was an assistant on Akira. So there you go. You learned something. You learned that Satoshi Kon helped draw Akira now. Yeah, it's all connected.
It is. It's all connected. If there's anything that Akira should teach us, it's that it's all connected.
Yes, and we strive to connect people together with the comics alternative. So it all comes together in that way as well.
We're like it sounds like you're just describing a dating service.
I don't know about that, but see, I was glad that that was a reference that I was making as a way of ending our episode. But then when you put it in the language of a dating service, that kind of ruined it.
It just reminded me of the casual encounters section of Craigslist, and I felt like you should know.
Okay, thank you very much. So we started off with discussing Ken Niimura's Henshin, published through Image Comics, a collection of 13 individual stories. And we spent the last part of this episode looking at the long saga of Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira. And we also talked quite a bit about the anime version as well. So definitely check these titles out. And places where you can get these titles, go to the sister company of our sponsor, and that is In Stock Trades. With DiscountComicBookService.com, DCBService.com, you can pre-order your comics. And so when it comes to pre-ordering manga, that's the place to go. But if you want books that are already out, then go to the sister company, In Stock Trades. That's InStockTrades.com. If you go there now, you'll find Henshin at 42% off of the cover price. So instead of paying $19.99, you only pay $11.59. You can also find all volumes of Akira at 25% off of the cover price. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think about those works of manga. You can get in touch with us by going to the website, and on the right-hand side of your browser, you'll find a tab that says Send Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can leave us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. You can email the show at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can contact me directly at derek@comicsalternative.com. And Shea, if they wanted to contact you directly, how could they do so?
They can email me at Shea@comicsalternative.com.
That's right. You can also find us on Twitter. We're at the number 2 guys with PhDs. We're also on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, and on Google+. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our list of reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at comicsalternative.com. And Shea, it's worth mentioning as well that we now have a growing and vibrant YouTube channel. Did you know about that?
I did know about that.
Yes. So if you're someone who consumes your podcast through YouTube, then, hey, go to YouTube at the Comics Alternative channel, and you can find a link to that from our webpage, comicsalternative.com. So let us hear from you however you listen to the podcast. We'd like to hear your reaction. And until next month, when Shea and I will be back for another manga episode, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
We'll see you later.